What is up, everybody? Welcome back to Rough Drafts. My name is Sam Pratt. If you haven't listened to this podcast before, I go deep on very specific topics in the current limited format, which is Tarkir Dragonstorm, and we're going to be talking about all things Temur. So I've been drafting pretty exclusively Temur up to this point, and I think there's a lot of different Temur decks that you can draft. I think there's a lot of important distinction between them, and let's dive in. So before I get into the specifics on Temur, I just want to outline some big picture thoughts that I have. And first and foremost, that is that this format is really difficult. I've seen a lot of people struggling so far, and I actually think I have a good grasp on why this format is so difficult and why people are having so much trouble with it. Just baseline, 3-color sets are going to be more difficult than 2-color sets. Because there are only 5 3-color decks in the format, the 5 clans, there's a level of baseline knowledge you need to know when you're drafting this format that if you take a green card first, you're only going to be pairing that most of the time with blue or with black. And then also just when you're playing a format that requires you to play a lot of colors, knowing when to pick lands, how to pick fixing, how to build your mana base, all of that stuff just makes the format on a ground level more difficult than the average limited format. So specifics about Tarkir though, moving on from just 3-color sets in general, the clans each have a signature mechanic, but building around that mechanic does not necessarily equal a coherent deck. In most limited formats, certain color pairs or maybe like 3 colors will have a mechanic, like a set mechanic. And if you kind of just take all of the cards that work with that mechanic, you're going to end up with a good deck. So the extreme example of this was Bloomburrow, which was a set that was targeted at new players. And if you basically just went into the Bloomburrow draft and took every card that had a picture of a rabbit on it, you would end up in a pretty good go wide deck, like a good green-white rabbits go wide deck. Obviously, Bloomburrow is the extreme example because it's so segmented between all of the creature types, and they did a lot of work on that set, I think, because they wanted it to be targeted towards new players. If you take a bunch of harmonized cards, because we're talking Temur today, and you just jam all of these harmonized cards together in your 3-color Temur deck, even if you have synergy like self-mill to get the harmonized cards in the graveyard, high power creatures to cast the harmonized cards for cheap, you're not necessarily going to have a good deck. And I think that's because this format is really powerful. There's a lot of good rares, 3-color sets. There's just better cards because they push the gold cards more. So I think you really need to be conscious of your deck's game plan more than others. So foresight on your deck's game plan, on your deck's macro archetype is really important. I think people are focusing way too much on what are my 3 colors, like am I going to end up in Jeskai or Mardu or Temur, and not enough about am I an aggro deck, am I a mid-range deck, do I have bombs that I can build towards and find with card advantage? Do I need to value cheap interaction because I'm looking like I'm a control deck? And I think that sort of stuff is way more important than locking in the open clan. So I've been playing almost exclusively Temur for the first week of the format, and I've been doing very well. But there's a pretty wide range of Temur decks that I draft. I've drafted Temur beatdown decks, Temur midrange decks, Temur control decks, etc. And not only is there a wide range of decks, but my base colors vary widely too. And this is another reason why 3-color sets are more difficult in general, because if I'm in Temur, I could be base green and splash blue and red equal. I could be base green blue. I could be base blue red. I could be base green red, etc. So there's just a lot going on. I really think the key to this format is to lock down what your deck's game plan is and build really hard towards that. So today I'm just going to be focused on Temur, and I'm going to go through all the different types of Temur decks that I've drafted. But I'm hoping that this cross analysis of one clan will be useful when you apply it to other clans. So say if you take Jeskai, you can find like a base red-white aggro deck or a blue-red Jeskai control deck, for instance. So let's talk about Temur. Like I said, I've been drafting, I think more than half of my drafts have been in the base Temur colors. So, either base green-red, blue-red, etc. I've been really successful in this format so far, especially drafting these Temur decks. I briefly broke 70% win rate in best of one, which was awesome. That's since dipped. I can feel the tide's turning a little bit and people are catching on to the good Temur cards. So I'm going to have to make some adjustments there. I still think these decks are going to be really good, especially because Temur has so many good rares. I haven't even drafted a Ureni, which is the 8-mana dragon that, Plague wins your opponent, or the Dragonback Assault Mythic, which is like the Temur landfall enchantment. I've been getting by with merely rares like Eshki or Roar of the Endless Song, and, good uncommons, of course. So there's 3 main flavors of Temur. One is beatdown, which is what I talked about last week. It's the Champion of Doosan. You play a 2-drop, 3-drop, 4-drop, and you just attack, get them dead, combat tricks, cheap interaction, etc. That's usually base green-blue or green-red. And I'll go in depth on each of these in a second. I'm just outlining them first. On the other end of the spectrum, you have hard control, which for me so far has been base blue-red, because you get a couple of really good cheap interaction spells when you're base blue-red. And this actually overlaps with Jeskai. Sometimes when I'm a base blue-red control deck, I'll be splashing some Temur cards or some Jeskai cards, or both. And then also, I have built Temur midrange a lot. I kind of warned in the intro a few minutes ago that you should try to avoid being just card quality midrange, but Temur has some really good cards. If you can fill your deck with mostly good uncommons, because usually this is a base green deck, your green monsters are just going to end the game pretty quickly. So I've actually liked Temur midrange quite a bit, and I'll of course go into detail on that later. This often overlaps with Sultai. Sultai gives you really good interaction in black, and also, just good rares sometimes too in black. So this is usually a base blue-green deck. So before I dive into each individual archetype, I'm going to talk about a couple cards that I really like that I think are great in all 3 versions of the deck. First and foremost is Karkik Guardian, which is the Temur Uncommon Dragon. It is 6 mana. It is a 6/5 flying trample vigilance and has hexproof until it deals damage. I'm obsessed with this card. I think it's probably the best uncommon in the set and really close to a lot of the rares. It's a phenomenal threat when you're on the front foot. So when you're attacking your opponent and you get to play a hexproof trampler that they can't deal with. And I've also loved it as a control finisher. So I think it's a pretty straightforward card. I'm not going to talk too much about it. And I think that's going to be the case for most of these cards that I really like in all 3 of the different macro archetypes of Temur. The next one I want to talk about is Molten Exhale, which is the red Exhale. It's 2 mana, deal 4, and then if you behold a dragon, you can cast it at instant speed. I actually think this might be the best Exhale. I have it really close to Sibsig Appraiser as the best common in the set. And I'm thinking going forward, now that the Temur decks have gotten a little more contested, I might be bumping this up close to or above Sibsig Appraiser, because it will let me bridge the gap between drafting Temur decks and drafting Mardu decks, which I think is the other pillar of the format. To stay on topic, I really like Molten Exhale. I'm playing a lot of dragons in most of my decks, so deal 4 instant at common is crazy. Shouldn't be too hard to see why that one's good either. The third one I want to talk about is Temur Tawnyback. This is the 3 mana 4/3. It's like the Temur hybrid mana card. This is performing really well in the data, and it matched my own experience of just being really happy with this guy. If you can cast it on 3, it's in pretty incredible rate. Like I mentioned on the previous episode, it smooths your draws in your opening sequence. Yeah, just can't say enough good things about this guy. Aenoch Wayfarer, which is the 2 mana 1/1 that mills 3 when it enters and you get a land. This is probably the best non-aggressive 2-drop in the set. It's basically 2 mana draw card. I talked a lot about it in my episode last week about hitting land drops. In a very similar vein, Sagu Wildling is fantastic. I talked about that last week too. It's the 3/3 dragon that has the omen that searches a basic. Very similar effect on your deck, Sagu Wildling and Aenoch Wayfarer. Most of my Temur decks are very happy playing either of those. Riverwalk Technique. This is 4 mana, instant, top or bottom a creature, or counter target non-creature spell. I think this is best in the beatdown decks and the control decks. The beatdown decks, because when you're attacking, you want your removal spells to be catch-all. And in control decks, just being able to hold up both a conditional counterspell and a removal spell for 4 mana is excellent. So I think this is at its worst in the kind of generic mid-range decks, but it's still a removal spell there. I still really like this card, and I think it's a pretty high pick. And last but not least is Unending Whisper, which is the 1 mana draw card in blue that has a harmonized cost. This is another one, like I mentioned last episode, it smooths your opening sequences. I've just been really happy with this in all of my Temur decks. Either I'm a control deck and the card advantage is good, or I'm kind of like a more play to the board card, and it really helps me double spell when I'm playing large green creatures. So I'm really happy with 1 or more copies of Unending Whisper, and it's a card I take decently highly. All right. I'll start talking about the actual macro archetypes now, and we're going to start with the lowest on the curve. I'm going to talk about my Temur beatdown decks. So I talked about base green beatdown last week, and this is basically just that same exact shell, just looking specifically at the cards in base green red or green blue. And yes, I did mention green red. I did trophy with a base green red, splashing a couple blue cards, green beatdown deck, and it was sick. This aggressive deck is more of a backup when you find your lane. Say you find you're in like a base green deck, but you don't open like a crazy good bomb, and you also don't open a ton of great cheap interaction to build a control deck. So often when you're in that scenario, your best course of action, like I mentioned last week, is to just pick up a bunch of guys that have a bunch of power and toughness and attack your opponent's life points to 0. And building around that is pretty nice in this format. There's a couple of good combat tricks and ways to push damage that I really like. 2-drops are really important in this deck, way more important than any of the other Temur decks, specifically 2-drop creatures. Green has a couple good ones. It's got the Botanist at uncommon. That is Traveling Botanist, which is a 2 mana 2/3. When it's tapped, you get a kind of surveil one and put it into your hand if it's a land. Just a really overstated 2-drop. Undergrowth Leopard, 2 mana 2/2 Vigilance. You can pay 1 sack it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. This guy's sweet. This is a good home for this card. I actually think this is a pretty good 2-drop in this deck. It wears counters really well from, say, a Champion of Doosan or Sagu Pummeler. The blow up an artifact or enchantment mode has been really relevant for me. There's a bunch of random artifacts or enchantments, like you can blow up a Saga or a Banishing Light, etc. Red actually gives you a couple of good 2-drops too, notably Shock Brigade, which is 2 mana 1/3 Menace and has Mobilize 1. This is like one of the best aggressive creatures in the entire set. And while it's more a go wide, like Mobilize Mardu card, I think it plays really well in the base green-red beatdown decks too. I would definitely keep an eye out for this if it's coming late. I would recommend paying attention to these in the pack if you're a base green deck kind of without a direction, as this is a really important 2-drop for any red aggressive deck. This is the best spot for Piercing Exhale, which is the green punch spell. And also Dragon Claw Strike, which is one of my favorite cards in the set. It's the Temur hybrid uncommon. It's 3 mana with the weird 2-bird cost. It doubles a creature's power and toughness, and then you get to fight. I've stolen a lot of games with this, attacking with a enormous trampler, attacking with an enormous card kick guardian. I think this card's a little underrated. I see it really late in packs pretty often. And I like it in most of my Temur decks, not even just beatdown decks, as long as I have enough creatures or a couple of card kick guardians, because that's really the wombo combo. A couple of interesting cards up the curve. Obviously, Champion of Doosan, Sagu Pummeler, like I mentioned last week. Constrictor Sage. This is a card that's been underperforming. This is the 5 mana 4/4 that taps and stuns something, and then it has a renew ability to stun something. This has kind of been an underperformer in the format. But I actually really like it here. I think it's a really nice curve topper. Same with Ice Ridge Serpent, which is a card that's been performing kind of surprisingly better than Constrictor Sage. This is the 5 mana 3/3 bounce something when it enters. A couple of red cards I like, because I do think base red-green is a really good spot for this deck. You still get to play a lot of the good blue cards because you can still be like a Temur deck. Just if you're a base red-green, I would be on the lookout also for Rescue Leopard, which is a 3 mana 4/2. When it's tapped, you can discard a card, draw a card. And then Summit Intimidator, which is 4 mana for a 4/3 reach. When it enters, something can't block. Just a couple of nice curve-filling, high-power red creatures to supplement. If your curve is really low, like you don't have too many 4s and 5s, you're mostly 2s and 3s, I think that Spectral Denial and Dispelling Exhale, which are two of the blue counterspells in this set, I think those are really nice if your curve is very low. So I'd be on the lookout for those if you are a base green-blue beatdown deck. A couple more power boosting things. Sarkhan's Resolve is the +3 trick that also has Plummet attached. That card's great. And Synchronized Charge, which is the kind of travel preparations callback. It's 2 counters distributed, and your creatures get Vigilance and Trample if they have a counter, and it has Harmonize. Notably, I'm not crazy about Sib-Sig Appraiser in these decks. Sib-Sig Appraiser is the 3-mana 2/1 kind of Organ Hoarder callback. It's the consensus best common at this point, but in the green-red draft I trophied with, I was passing these just because they don't have quite enough power and toughness that you want in some of these decks. If I was a base green-blue deck pretty heavily, I would still happily take them. Just when I'm drafting base green beatdown, at this point I'm really on the lookout for green-red as a base. Moving on from the beatdown decks, I'm going to talk about midrange, Temur midrange. And I did forewarn against drafting generic card quality midrange decks, but I have liked my Temur midrange decks. If you open a really good bomb like Eshki or Roar of the Endless Song, which is the Saga, this is a really good place to maximize them. If you're not a dedicated beatdown deck, you really want to make sure you're not playing dorky 2-drops. I've been very, very picky about my 2-drops in general in this format, and something like Sultai Devotee, which is the 2/1 Death Touch, or the Undergrowth Leopard, which I do like in the beatdown decks. If I'm not a dedicated beatdown deck, I really want my cheap cards to enable my more powerful, expensive things. And I do think that kind of generic midrange is a decent spot for Temur because it plays green. Your green cards are going to have high power and toughness, so they can actually end the game pretty quickly, which is a problem that a midrange deck might have. If you don't have enough pressure on the opponent, you give them outs for them to draw their bombs. So like I said, early part of the curve, you really want to focus on consistency, things that help you hit land drops, like I mentioned in the last episode. So Sib-Sig Appraiser, Anok Wayfarer, Temur Monument is awesome here. There's a lot of overlap with Sultai. I've had a bunch of green-blue based decks where the early parts of the curve have the Wayfarers and the Appraisers, and then I'm kind of splashing Caustic Exhale and Dragon's Prey. Just as good interaction spells, and there's some good rares in Sultai as well. This does share a lot of cards with beatdown decks, so I'll play Champion of Doosan here, I'll play Sagu Pummeler here. I really like Piercing Exhale in these decks as well, but a lot of the margins are different, and I think that's really important to understand in this format. You love Sib-Sig Appraiser in these decks, and often you're going to want your interaction to be a lot better. So it's kind of a sliding scale. Like the more Molten Exhales I can fill the early parts of my curve with, the less I feel like I need to beat down and play dorky 2-mana creatures in ways to get them to attack. I love Mammoth Bellow in these decks. That's the 5-mana Temur sorcery that makes a 5/5 that has Harmonize. It's just a 2-for-1. And this deck loves 2-for-1s, and it's also a 2-for-1 that puts an enormous amount of power and toughness on the board. So with this deck, you really want to be focused on card quality. You want your deck to have better cards than your opponent, and you want those better cards to be able to end the game, decently quickly. Not pressing spacebar every single turn. You got to be able to turn the corner as fast as you want. And a word of caution about counterspells in these decks as well. The Temur midrange decks want to tap out every turn, so it's often really awkward to want to hold counterspells up. They can still be okay to round out your curve if you maybe need a little more cheap interaction. The Dispelling Exhale is still going to be a good card, but they're definitely a little bit worse than normal. All right, and then I'm going to wrap it up by talking through Temur Control. I think one of the cool things about this format is in a lot of formats, you need bombs to play control decks. And what I mean by that is a control deck, by definition, is a deck that wants the game to go long. And in Limited the past couple years, really one of the only reasons to want a game to go long is if you have like an unbeatable rare in your deck. And I think in this format, the cheap interaction is good enough that you don't need a crazy game-ending rare to want the game to go long. The really important part about these control decks are cheap interaction. So a ton of exhales, basically. Most of my Temur control decks are base blue-red with the option to pivot either into Jeskai or into Temur or both. The draws to Temur would be you do get a lot of great rares. Like I said, you don't need good rares to play control in this format, but they certainly help. In limited, a lot of control decks don't need a classic control like hexproof finisher, but we actually do have one in this format in Card Kit Guardian, and I've built a lot of control decks already. A lot of cheap interaction, a lot of card advantage, and then you play a Card Kit Guardian, untap, hold up counter magic for the rest of the game, and kill them with your giant trampling flyer. And it feels sweet. That's one of my favorite things to do in this format. Like I said, you need a ton of exhales to play this deck, which can happen. So Molten Exhale, which is the deal 4, you want a lot of counter magic in this deck. You really want Dispelling Exhale. Like I said with the mid-range, you want to be very picky about your 2-drops. If you're base blue-red, there really aren't very good defensive 2-drop creatures in this set that are worth playing in a control deck like this, so I'll pretty often play actual 0. One card you do get that I really like is Glacial Dragon Hunt. That's the blue-red sorcery that draws a card and then you can discard a card to deal 3, and it has Harmonize. That's another piece of really good cheap interaction that you can play in these decks. One combo I really like is Focus the Mind plus Narset's Rebuke. So Narset's Rebuke is the 5-mana deal 5 instant. Very important that it's an instant. And then when you cast Narset's Rebuke, you deal 5, that creature is exiled, and then you add 3 mana. And Focus the Mind is the 5-mana instant draw 3 discard 1 that costs 3 if you've already cast a spell. So you can play Narset's Rebuke and then use the 3 mana you made to cast Focus the Mind. That's a really good combo. In these Temur decks, like just Temur across the board, most of them are not really happy holding up 5 mana, except the control decks. The control decks are just really happy to pass with 5 mana open and see what the opponent does. You get to hold up Focus the Mind for the full retail 5 mana. You also get to hold up counter magic. And then if they do play something worth killing, you get to Narset's Rebuke kind of for free there. So really sweet card. Another great instant is Bewildering Blizzard, which is the 6 mana creatures your opponents control get -3 and then draw 3. Another great thing to hold up at instant speed, and the control decks are unique in that you're often able to hold them up at instant speed. And I'm going to wrap it up there. I've really loved drafting Temur over the last week. I think it's my favorite 3-color combination in Magic in general. I've had a lot of fun diving into the different decks. I really like this format because I think, like how Temur, you can build beatdown, mid-range, or control. I think that dynamic exists in most of the clans. So I think this format is really deep, and I'm excited to kind of get to know the other clans better. I have been drafting mostly Temur up to this point. I can feel the tides turning, and I'm going to have to start taking black and white cards pretty soon. And, I'm excited to figure it out. I'm also going to include a bunch of different Temur draft logs in the description. I've been including my 17 lands logs for the past couple episodes, if you haven't noticed. I think that's probably really helpful to see the things that I'm talking about in practice. So yeah, check those out if you want to see all these different flavors of Temur decks. So if you have any feedback, if you have a card or a concept or a certain deck that you'd like for me to talk about on next week's episode, please reach out. You can find me on Blue Sky at sampratt.bsky.social. And I'm also on Discord at samp6. Hope you're enjoying the format as much as I am, and see you next week.